There are moments in life when the wrong person gets silenced at exactly the wrong time. Adrian Knox had spent 15 years learning every bolt, every wire, every classified system inside Skyforge's most advanced military aircraft. He knew something was wrong before the diagnostic even finished running. He told them. He showed them. And Victoria Hale, CEO, cover of 3 business magazines, woman who had never once turned a wrench in her life, looked him dead in the eye and told him to get off her runway. What happened in the next 4 hours will change everything you think you know about who actually keeps people alive. If stories like this hit different for you, subscribe right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The night came in low and cold over Delamar Air Complex, the kind of November dark that settled into the tarmac and didn't let go. Runway lights cut pale yellow lines across the concrete, and somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, the desert stretched out flat and indifferent in every direction. Inside Hangar 7, the aircraft sat under full illumination, a Skyforge DX-9 Sentinel, the most sophisticated defense platform the company had ever built, and the most expensive thing Adrian Knox had touched in his 38 years on Earth. He was underneath it with a pen light clenched between his teeth and a laptop balanced on a rolling cart when he first noticed it. Not an alarm, not a warning light, just a number that didn't match. He pulled the pen light out of his mouth and stared at the readout again. Pressurization cycle variance sector 4. The figure was off by a margin so small that most automated systems would log it as sensor drift and move on. Adrian didn't move on. He'd written part of the diagnostic protocol that flagged anomalies exactly like this one 3 years ago on a Department of Defense contract he wasn't supposed to talk about in public. He knew what normal looked like. This wasn't it. He straightened up, knocked his shoulder on a hydraulic access panel, said something under his breath that he wouldn't repeat around his mother, and reached for his radio. "Knox to hangar control. I need a maintenance hold on the Sentinel. Who's supervising tonight?" Static, then. "That'd be facilities lead Dominguez, but Mr. Knox, the aircraft is on a 4-hour departure window. Ms. Hale is already on site." He paused. "Copy that," he said. "Tell Dominguez I need to talk to him before anyone touches that departure checklist." He didn't wait for confirmation. He was already moving. Victoria Hale had not slept in 31 hours, and she had stopped pretending that coffee was helping sometime around midnight. She stood at the glass wall of the hangar's upper observation deck, arms crossed, watching her ground crew move around the Sentinel like ants around a sugar cube. Efficient, purposeful, on schedule. The Sentinel wasn't just a plane, it was a statement. Skyforge Dynamics had spent 4 years and a number with 9 figures attached to it developing this aircraft for a classified defense program, and tonight was the first operational deployment, a live military mission flight that would either cement the company's future or expose every weakness she'd spent the last 18 months papering over. The contract renewal board met in 6 days. If the Sentinel flew tonight, Skyforge was untouchable. If it didn't, she wasn't sure there would be a Skyforge to protect. She heard the door open behind her and turned, expecting Philip Chen, her operations VP. Instead, she got a man in a gray work jacket with grease on his left forearm and a laptop tucked under his arm like a textbook. "Ms. Hale." He stopped a few feet inside the door. "I'm Adrian Knox. I'm on the contracted maintenance team for the DX-9 classified systems. I need to flag something before the departure window opens." She studied him for exactly 1 second. Badge was legitimate. Name rang a distant bell from a staffing manifest she'd skimmed 3 weeks ago. "Talk to Dominguez," she said, and turned back to the window. "I tried. He told me to bring it up the chain because it falls under the classified system threshold." He came closer, set the laptop on the counter beside her without asking permission, and pulled up the readout. "Pressurization variance in Sector 4. It's subtle. The automated system flagged it as probable sensor error. I don't think it is." She looked at the screen. Numbers. A graph. A small deviation that, to her eye, looked like nothing. "How significant?" "I don't know yet. That's why I need the hold." "How long?" "Minimum 3 hours for a full sector inspection. Could be longer if I find something behind the panel." 3 hours. She felt the number land somewhere in her chest like a stone dropping into water. 3 hours put them past the departure window. Past the window meant requesting a military extension, which meant paperwork, which meant questions, which meant the kind of attention she did not want on this aircraft tonight. Mr. Knox, she kept her voice even. This aircraft has been through 3 full pre-flight cycles in the last 48 hours. It's been certified by 2 separate inspection teams. Are you telling me that everyone who looked at this plane before tonight missed something that you found in... She glanced at the timestamp on his screen. 40 minutes? I'm telling you this number doesn't match what I'd expect to see. I could be wrong. You could be wrong, she repeated. Yes. But you want to ground a classified defense aircraft, delay a military mission, and potentially trigger a contract review. Because you could be wrong. He didn't flinch, which surprised her. Most people, when she used that tone, took a half step back. He just looked at her steadily and said, I want to spend 3 hours making sure I am wrong. Because if I'm not wrong, and we find out at altitude, the conversation we're having right now is the last interesting thing that happens to anyone on that aircraft. The room was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Get off my runway. He'd been dismissed before. 12 years as a contract technician meant you learned to read the room fast, and the room had been crystal clear. She wasn't interested in what he thought he knew. He was a contractor. She was the CEO. The org chart was not ambiguous. He walked back down to the hangar floor, stowed his laptop in his kit bag, and stood for a moment just looking at the Sentinel. It was a beautiful aircraft. That was the thing nobody ever said out loud in rooms like this. But it was true. The lines were clean, the engineering was genuinely elegant, and the classified systems package buried in its belly represented the sharpest military avionics work he'd done in his career. He'd spent 8 months on that systems integration. He knew this aircraft the way a surgeon knows an anatomy. Not from pictures, but from having been inside it. The number was still wrong. He pulled out his personal phone and opened his notes app. He wrote down the exact readout, the timestamp, and the words, Flagged, dismissed, no action taken, 2247. He'd learned that habit from a mentor 15 years ago who told him, in a voice that didn't invite argument, always write down when you said something. Not for them. For you. Then he zipped his kit bag and sat down on an equipment case near the far wall of the hangar to wait. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. He just wasn't ready to leave. What? The ground crew worked around him. Nobody told him to go away, which was something. He recognized a few faces from previous rotation cycles on the Skyforge maintenance contract. A fuel systems tech named Ruiz, who nodded at him from across the hangar. A structural inspector named Park, who was too focused on her checklist to notice much else. Competent people, all of them, doing their jobs. He watched the departure prep unfold with the particular attention of someone who can't stop knowing what they know. Loading sequences, communication system checks, exterior walk-around, standard procedure executed cleanly, nothing obviously wrong, except the number. He'd pulled it up on his phone now, staring at it, trying to talk himself out of it the way Victoria Hale wanted him to. Sensor drift was real. Calibration artifacts happened. In 8 years of working on pressurized military platforms, he'd chased dozens of anomalies that turned out to be exactly what the automated systems said they were. False positives, electronic noise, the mechanical equivalent of static on a radio. Maybe this was that. Maybe. He was still staring at the readout when Philip Chen appeared at his elbow. Chen was Skyforge's VP of operations, a compact man in his late 40s who always looked like he'd just come from a meeting he hadn't entirely survived. He had the slightly hunted expression of someone whose job was to sit between the CEO and every problem that the CEO didn't want to deal with directly. Knox, he said it quietly, not looking at him. You submitted a maintenance flag. I flagged an anomaly, yes. Ms. Hale says it's been reviewed and cleared. Ms. Hale reviewed it for about 45 seconds. Chen's jaw moved slightly. I need you to understand the position we're in tonight. This isn't a routine commercial flight. The operational significance of... I know what the operational significance is, Adrian said. I helped build the systems package that makes this aircraft operationally significant. That landed. Chen looked at him for the first time. I'm not trying to blow up your contract window, Adrian continued, keeping his voice low and even. I'm telling you there's a discrepancy I can't explain, and the responsible thing to do is explain it before the aircraft leaves the ground. That's it. That's the whole thing." Chen studied him for a long moment with the expression of a man who genuinely didn't know which problem was bigger. Then he said, "I'll see what I can do," and walked away. Adrian watched him go without much hope. The call came 40 minutes later. Not to Chen, not to Dominguez, to Victoria Hale directly, on a number that didn't ring often, from a federal agency that didn't leave voicemails. She took it in the hangar office with the door closed, and the three people who were close enough to watch through the glass window said afterward that her face went through about 4 different expressions in the span of 90 seconds. None of them were the expression she usually wore, which was confident and a little impatient and entirely in control. When she came out, she didn't say anything for a moment. She stood in the middle of the hangar floor and looked around until she found Adrian sitting on the equipment case by the far wall. "Knox," her voice carried across the hangar. The ground crew looked up. "Come with me." He stood, picked up his kit bag, and walked toward her. Up close, something in her face was different. Not softer, exactly, but recalibrated. Like someone who'd just been handed information that changed the math on everything. "The Federal Oversight Liaison for this program," she said, keeping her voice low, "just informed me that the classified defense systems aboard that aircraft fall under a restricted access protocol I wasn't fully briefed on. Apparently the integration work on those systems was done under a DoD subauthorization that limits who can perform maintenance inspection on them." She stopped. "Your name is on the authorization." He looked at her without expression. "Your name," she said again, and it came out slightly differently the second time, like she was still processing it, "is the only name on the Level 3 authorization for this aircraft's classified systems." "I know," he said. She held his gaze. "You knew that when you came to me earlier." "Yes." "And you led with the pressurization variants." "Because that's what I found. The authorization is just paperwork. The variance is what I'm worried about." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the hangar had gotten very still in the way that spaces get when everyone is pretending very hard not to listen. "What do you need?" she finally said. 3 hours, he said, "and access to the Sector 4 panels." She looked at him for another second, and he could see her doing the calculation, the contract window, the federal call, the gap between what she'd believed about tonight an hour ago and what she was being told now. It wasn't a comfortable calculation. It didn't resolve neatly. "You've got it," she said. He was back under the aircraft 7 minutes later. The ground crew gave him room without being asked, which was either professional courtesy or the specific kind of deference people extend to someone who's just been quietly reinstated after a public dismissal. Either way, he didn't spend energy on it. He had his kit open on the rolling cart, his laptop running the full diagnostic suite, and his pen light back between his teeth. The Sector 4 access panel came off with 6 bolts and a connector harness that he handled carefully because it was $40,000 worth of sensor array, and it wasn't his to break. He set it aside, adjusted his headlamp, and looked into the cavity behind it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and took a photograph. Then he took 6 more. The variance he'd flagged from the outside wasn't sensor drift. It wasn't a calibration artifact or electronic noise. It was a physical modification, a small, precise alteration to the pressurization regulation assembly that would have been completely invisible to any standard inspection protocol and nearly invisible to the diagnostic system he'd helped design, except for one measurement signature that the system logged in Sector 4 and nowhere else. Whoever had done this knew the aircraft. They knew the diagnostic system. They knew exactly where to work and exactly how to stay below the threshold that would trigger an automatic flag. Adrian sat back on his heels and looked at the modification for a long moment. This wasn't a manufacturing defect. It wasn't a maintenance error. Someone had built a failure into this aircraft on purpose, and they'd built it carefully enough that it was almost invisible, and would have been completely invisible if he hadn't written the exact diagnostic protocol that caught it, and if he hadn't spent enough time with this specific aircraft to know what numbers were supposed to look like. He reached for his radio. "Knox to hangar control," he said. "I need Victoria Hale down here, and I need someone to make sure nobody leaves this facility tonight." His voice was level, calm, The kind of calm that comes not from confidence, but from the moment when a person stops hoping they're wrong and starts dealing with the fact that they aren't. Outside the hangar, the desert was still and cold and dark in every direction. The aircraft sat under the lights and waited. Victoria Hale came down from the observation deck faster than anyone had seen her move all night. She didn't run. She wasn't the kind of person who ran in front of her staff, but she moved with the specific urgency of someone who had just been told the floor was on fire and was trying to appear calm while getting to the exit. Philip Chen fell in beside her automatically, the way he always did, and she didn't tell him to stay back, which meant she wanted a witness. Adrian was still crouched near the open access panel when she reached him. He stood when he heard her footsteps and stepped aside so she could see into the cavity without having to ask. She looked. She wasn't an engineer. She'd said that herself in enough board presentations to have made it part of her personal brand. The CEO who understood business, not bolts. But she'd been around aircraft long enough to know what stock components looked like versus something that had been handled recently. The modification inside Sector 4 had the particular quality of work that had been done carefully and quickly, the kind of careful that is actually the opposite of careful, because it's trying not to be noticed. "Tell me what I'm looking at," she said. "The pressurization regulation assembly for this sector has been physically altered." He pointed with his pen light without touching anything. "This coupling here, it's been replaced. The replacement is spec compatible, meaning it fits, it functions, it won't trigger a standard inspection flag, but it has a pressure-tolerant ceiling that's about 12% lower than the original component." What does that mean in plain language? It means the aircraft pressurizes normally on the ground, takes off fine, climbs fine. Somewhere above 31,000 feet, the regulation fails. At that altitude, with a military payload and crew, you're looking at a rapid decompression event inside of 4 minutes. Chen made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Victoria didn't make any sound at all. She stared at the panel for another few seconds, then straightened up and turned to face Adrian fully. "How long has this been here?" "I don't know. The component isn't degraded, so it was installed recently. My best estimate based on the fitting marks, within the last 72 hours. "This aircraft was in restricted access status for the last 72 hours, she said slowly. "Hangar 7 is keycard access only. There are maybe 20 people with clearance to be in this building." "I know," Adrian said. The weight of that settled over all three of them. Victoria looked at Chen. Chen looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. She looked back at Adrian. "What else do you need to check?" "Everything," he said simply. "If someone got in here and modified the pressurization assembly, I need to know if that's the only thing they touched. And I need to do it in a way that doesn't compromise the evidence, because the second we start pulling components without documentation, we lose the chain of custody. So we do this by the book. We do this by the book." She nodded once, and something shifted in her bearing, not softened exactly, but refocused. She pulled out her phone and made 2 calls in rapid succession. One to Skyforge's head of corporate security, a former federal agent named Garrett Tully, who she'd hired specifically because she hoped she'd never need him for something like this. And one to the federal oversight liaison who'd called her 40 minutes ago, and who was, she now realized, not going to be surprised by anything she had to tell him. While she made the calls, Adrian went back to work. He started with the communication systems because they were his specialty, and because, if he was building a failure sequence into an aircraft, that's where he'd want his second hidden problem. The military communication array on the Sentinel was a classified package, 3 layers of encryption, a proprietary frequency management system, and a fail-safe protocol that he'd helped architect during the DoD integration phase. He knew it the way he knew his own handwriting. The diagnostic ran for 11 minutes. Adrian sat on a low stool and watched the numbers scroll and tried to keep his mind from running ahead of the data. He'd been in situations before where something was wrong with an aircraft. 14 years in aviation maintenance meant you accumulated a certain number of those moments. The loose fitting discovered on pre-flight, the hydraulic anomaly caught during taxi, the communication dropout on a shakedown flight that turned out to be a corroded connector rather than anything catastrophic. Those situations had a particular texture. The tightness in the chest, the slightly slowed-down quality of perception, the way every number on a screen becomes important in a way it isn't when everything is fine. This felt different. This felt like standing in a burning building and not knowing yet how many exits were blocked. The diagnostic finished. He looked at the result for a long moment without moving. Then he pulled out his phone and photographed the screen. Then he opened his Notes app and typed "hand steady." Milcom array. Authentication log gap, 11:14 p.m., November 7th through 3:52 a.m., November 8th, 76 minutes of missing entries. Not a system error. Logs manually cleared. 76 minutes of missing security log entries in the military communication system. The kind of gap that didn't happen by accident, didn't happen through power failure, didn't happen through any technical malfunction he could construct a plausible explanation for. Someone had accessed the communication array during that window and then erased the record of doing so. He set the phone down, pressed both palms flat against his thighs for a second, and exhaled. Then he picked up his radio and asked for Victoria Hale. She came back across the hangar with Garrett Tully, who turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in rooms where being loud was a liability. He looked at Adrian's screen without any of the civilian reaction that Chen had shown. No sharp intake of breath, no color draining from his face, just reading, processing, filing. 76 minutes, Tully said. Starting at 11:14 on the 7th, Adrian confirmed. That's 2 nights ago. Yes. Who had access to this hangar 2 nights ago? That's what I was about to suggest we figure out. Adrian looked at Victoria. Your keycard access system. Who administers it? And where are the logs stored? IT security, she said. The logs are on an internal server. Tully... Already on it, Tully said and stepped away with his phone. Victoria stayed. She watched Adrian pull up a second diagnostic window and begin cross-referencing the communication system's internal timestamp data against the external log gap. It was painstaking work, the kind of thing that looked, to anyone watching, like a man staring at a screen and occasionally clicking. But she didn't leave. She stood slightly to his left with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and after a while she said, quietly enough that it didn't carry, I owe you an apology. He didn't look up from the screen. You don't have to do that right now. I dismissed you in front of your colleagues. You had reasons. I had pressures, she said, and the distinction in her voice was the sound of someone being honest with themselves in a way that clearly cost something. That's not the same thing. He glanced at her then, briefly. Let's get through tonight first. She nodded, accepting the deferral, and went back to watching the screen. The keycard logs came back 40 minutes later, and what they showed stopped the conversation in the hangar office cold. Tully spread 3 printed pages across the table. He'd gotten the access records for Hangar 7 going back 2 weeks, cross-referenced against the personnel manifest for the Sentinel program. Most of the entries were exactly what you'd expect. Maintenance crew, inspection teams, fueling personnel, the kind of ordinary traffic that a major aircraft in final pre-flight generates. But on the night of November 7th, between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., there was a single keycard entry at 11:09. One person, into the hangar, out at 1:04 in the morning. The name on the entry was Grant Mercer. Victoria stared at the page. Grant was here that night? According to the log, Tully said. He didn't tell me that. She said it more to herself than to either of them. He was at the operations review meeting that afternoon. He never mentioned coming back to the hangar. Grant Mercer was Skyforge's director of operations. One of the 4 most senior people in the company, the person responsible for overseeing the maintenance and certification pipeline for every aircraft in the program. He'd been with the company for 9 years. He sat 3 offices down from Victoria's on the executive floor. His name was on the wall plaques from 2 industry safety awards. Adrian, standing across the table, looked at the entry and felt the shape of the thing shift in his mind. The modification to the pressurization assembly, the cleared communication logs, a 76-minute window 2 nights ago, accessed by someone with a senior keycard and enough technical knowledge to work on a classified military aircraft without leaving an obvious trace. I need to look at the maintenance records for the last certification cycle, he said, the ones filed with the Federal Program Office. And I need the originals, not the digital copies. Why originals? Victoria asked. Because digital records can be edited. Paper records leave different kinds of marks when they've been altered. He paused. Who manages the certification documentation for the Sentinel program? She already knew the answer. He could see it in her face before she said it. Grant's office. The document room was on the second floor of the operations building, adjacent to the hangar. It smelled like recycled air and printer toner, and the filing system was the particular organized chaos of a department that had been understaffed for 2 years and knew it. Adrian and Tully worked through it together while Victoria stood in the doorway, and Philip Chen sat in a chair in the corner, looking like a man who had developed a headache several hours ago and seen no reason to expect it to end. The original maintenance logs for the Sentinel's last 3 certification cycles were in a locked cabinet that Tully opened with a master key after a brief phone call to facilities. Adrian pulled the most recent binder, the certification completed 6 days ago, the one that had cleared the Sentinel for tonight's mission flight, and set it on the table under the fluorescent light. He went through it page by page. Most of it was clean. Competent documentation, properly signed, with the kind of routine thoroughness that certification cycles generate, because the people doing the work understand the consequences of getting it wrong. But on page 47, in the section covering pressurization system inspection, there was a discrepancy. It was small, the kind of small that requires you to know what you're looking for. A reference number that didn't match. Not wrong enough to fail an audit, but inconsistent with the component designation for the original pressurization regulation assembly in Sector 4. The number matched, instead, the spec-compatible replacement component he'd found installed when he opened the panel 2 hours ago. Someone had updated the documentation to reflect a component replacement that was never officially logged as a replacement. "This is falsified," Adrian said. Tully came around the table and looked over his shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. "Can you prove it?" The component designation number references a part that isn't in the approved parts list for this aircraft's pressurization system. It's spec-compatible. That's how it passed a visual inspection. But it's not the authorized component. The certification should have flagged it. It didn't. He turned the page. And the inspector's initials on this page are different from the same inspector's initials on every other page in this binder. Different how? The loop on the G is closed. Every other page, it's open. He flipped back and forth twice to show it. It's subtle, but it's consistent. Whoever changed this page either forged the initials or had the original inspector sign a replacement page without telling them what it was for. Tully straightened up and pulled out his phone again. This time the call he made wasn't to IT security. Adrian set the binder down and looked at the wall for a moment. His eyes were tired. He was aware, now that the immediate focus had narrowed, that he'd been in this hangar for over 4 hours and had eaten nothing since a gas station sandwich at 6 p.m. His shoulder still ached from where he'd knocked it on the hydraulic panel. These were small, stupid human details, but they were present, crowding the edges of his concentration. He went back to the binder. By 2:30 in the morning, the picture had been assembled from enough separate pieces that it was no longer a theory. The pressurization modification, the cleared communication logs, the falsified certification documentation with the forged inspector's initials, the keycard entry placing Grant Mercer in the hangar during the 76-minute blackout window. And one more thing, which Tully's security team had found when they pulled the communication system's hardware logs separately from the software logs that had been cleared. The hardware logs were stored on a physically isolated chip that couldn't be accessed through software. They didn't record content, just connection events, timestamps, and device signatures. And in the 76-minute window, a device signature had connected to the Sentinel's military communication array that didn't appear anywhere in the authorized equipment manifest. The device signature matched a diagnostic tablet registered to the operations director's office. When Tully laid that piece of paper on the table next to the keycard log, the falsified certification page, and Adrian's photographs of the modified pressurization assembly, the room went quiet in the way that rooms do when a group of people arrive at the same conclusion at the same moment, and none of them want to be the first to say it out loud. Victoria said it. Grant did this. Nobody argued with her. Chen, from his chair in the corner, said quietly, "We need to be careful about—" "I'm not making an accusation," she said, cutting him off without raising her voice. "I'm looking at 4 separate pieces of documentation and asking someone to tell me what other explanation covers all of them. Can you do that, Philip?" Chen couldn't. He looked at the table and said nothing. Tully said, I've already got Federal on the line. They want to know where Mercer is right now. He's supposed to be here, Victoria said. She looked at Adrian. He's on the departure authorization team. He was scheduled to sign the final clearance at 0300. Adrian checked the clock on the wall. 40 minutes. Then we'll find out if he shows up, Tully said. Sam. Adrian went back to the aircraft. Not because anyone asked him to. Everyone's attention had shifted toward the human problem, the question of Grant Mercer, and what he'd done and why he'd done it. That was its own gravity, and it was pulling Chen and Tully and Victoria into a set of conversations and phone calls that didn't require him. But there was still an aircraft sitting on the hangar floor with a modified pressurization assembly and a 76-minute hole in its communication logs, and nobody else in this building was authorized to inspect those systems, and Adrian Knox did not know how to leave a broken thing alone. He put on a fresh pair of gloves, picked up his kit, and went back in. The communication array took 2 hours to go through properly. He documented every access point, cross-referenced every connection log the hardware chip had recorded, and built a picture of exactly what had been done during that 76-minute window. It was meticulous, uncomfortable work, the kind that requires you to hold a complete technical structure in your head while simultaneously processing what each deviation from that structure means in practical terms. What he found was worse than a simple tampering. The pressurization modification was designed to produce a failure at altitude. That was catastrophic, but it was in some ways the obvious thing, the thing a person might do if their goal was to bring down an aircraft. What he found in the communication array was different, more subtle, and in some ways more disturbing because it showed planning. Someone had inserted a dormant protocol interrupt into the Sentinel's encrypted military communication system. It wouldn't activate on takeoff. It wouldn't activate during climb or cruise. It would activate at a specific altitude threshold, the same altitude range where the pressurization failure would begin, and it would systematically disable the aircraft's ability to send or receive distress communications. First, the pressurization fails. Then, before anyone can call for help, the communication system goes silent. Adrian sat back and looked at the ceiling of the hangar for a long moment. This wasn't sabotage designed to delay a contract or damage a company's reputation. This was designed to kill people and make it very hard for anyone to understand why. He took a breath, let it out slowly. Then he picked up his radio and asked for Tully, and when Tully answered, he said, simply and clearly, "You need to come back to the aircraft and bring whoever you've got from the federal side because what I'm looking at now is attempted murder, and I need someone with the right authority in the room when I explain it." There was a pause on the other end. Then Tully said, "Copy that. 2 minutes." Adrian sat with the aircraft and waited, the way he'd waited earlier in the night on that equipment case by the far wall, except that now the waiting had a different quality. Earlier he'd been waiting because he didn't know yet if he was right. Now he knew exactly what was here, and the weight of it was sitting on him like something physical, and the only thing he could do with it was hand it, carefully, accurately, completely, to the people who needed to act on it. Outside the hangar, the desert was dark and still. The runway lights ran their pale yellow lines into the distance and disappeared. Grant Mercer hadn't shown up yet for the 3 o'clock clearance sign-off. 40 minutes had become 30, and somewhere in this facility or beyond it, a man who had spent 9 years building a career inside this company was either still coming or already running. Sorensen's verification took 2 hours and 11 minutes. He worked through Adrian's documentation systematically. Every photograph, every log entry, every cross-reference between the hardware chip data and the software records, every step of the restoration protocol checked against the baseline specifications. He asked questions throughout, not challenging questions, not the kind designed to catch inconsistencies, but the specific technical questions of someone who understood what they were looking at and wanted to confirm that what they were seeing matched what the documentation said. Adrian answered each one directly and waited while Sorensen made his notes. The ground crew worked around them both. Nobody interfered. The hangar had settled into a different rhythm than it had held at the start of the night. Quieter, more deliberate, the specific tempo of people who understand that something serious has happened and that what comes next matters more than what came before. When Sorensen finished, he stood up from the rolling stool he'd commandeered, tucked his notebook into his jacket, and looked at the aircraft for a long moment. Your documentation is thorough, he said. I tried to be complete. You were. He turned to Adrian. I'm going to need to make a formal recommendation to the program office before this aircraft can be cleared. That process takes time I can't compress. He paused. But off the record, the restoration work you've done here is correct. Both systems. I'd stake my certification on that assessment. It wasn't a clearance. It wasn't the thing that would allow the aircraft to fly. But it was something, and Adrian took it for what it was and said, "Thank you." Sorensen nodded once and went to find a quiet corner to make his calls. Pasi Masami. The formal interrogation of Grant Mercer happened in a conference room in the operations building at 8:30 in the morning, and Adrian wasn't in it. He had no standing to be in it. He was a contract technician, not law enforcement, not federal, not legal. And even if he'd had standing, he wasn't sure he wanted to be there. What Grant had done was documented. What Grant had been thinking when he did it was a separate question, the kind that belonged to investigators and lawyers, and eventually, Adrian assumed, to a jury. What he did have standing to do was sit in the break room with a real breakfast. Flores had made a run at some point and come back with egg sandwiches and paper bags and a cardboard carrier of coffee that was dramatically better than what the break room machine produced, and go through his complete documentation package one final time to make sure nothing was missing before he submitted it to Sorensen's office. He was on page 12 of his notes when Victoria walked in. She poured herself a coffee without saying anything, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. She looked like someone who had been awake for over 24 hours and had stopped expecting to feel otherwise. The polished executive composure of the early part of the night was still there but had worn thinner in the way things do after enough hours. She was recognizably herself, just without the performance layer. "Legal is saying we'll be in depositions until spring," she said. "That's probably accurate. The board chairman called me 3 times between 6 and 8 a.m. She looked at her coffee. He's supportive. For now. That'll depend on how the contract office handles the delay and whether the federal program people decide to make Skyforge the story or make Grant the story. What do you think they'll do?" She considered it. "Grant, probably. The company cooperated. We called them. We gave them everything." She glanced at him. "You gave them everything. There isn't much of a case for institutional negligence when the contractor the institution tried to dismiss was the one who found everything and documented it perfectly." Adrian looked at his notes. "I didn't do it perfectly." She raised an eyebrow. "The fuel system review. I should have gone deeper on the secondary flow records. I made a judgment call that the primary logs were sufficient, and they were. But I didn't have a technical basis for that judgment in the moment. I just ran out of bandwidth at 4 a.m. and made a call." He turned a page. "It was the right call. But I made it for the wrong reason, and I need to note that in the documentation." She stared at him. "You're going to document the parts where you weren't sure?" "I'm going to document what I did and why I did it, including the moments where I was guessing." He looked up. "If I only document the parts where I was certain, the record is incomplete. And an incomplete record is how things go wrong the next time." She was quiet for a moment. "That's going to make the legal situation more complicated." "Maybe, but it's accurate." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something between respect and the slight discomfort of someone confronting a standard they hadn't been applying to themselves. "All right," she said. The conference room where Grant Mercer was being interviewed was on the opposite side of the operations building from the break room, which meant that the sounds of it, if there were any sounds worth hearing, didn't carry. Adrian finished his documentation, submitted it electronically to Sorensen's secure file drop, and was standing at the window looking at the runway when Tully came to find him. "They want you in there?" Tully said. Adrian turned from the window. "For what?" "He said something." Tully's expression was neutral in a way that wasn't entirely natural, the look of someone who had heard something surprising and was working to keep it contained. "About you specifically. Davin wants you to hear it directly." The conference room was smaller than it looked from the hallway. Davin sat at one end of the table with a recording device in front of her and a legal pad covered in handwriting. Grant Mercer's lawyer, a man who had arrived at 7 a.m., looking like he'd driven straight from wherever he'd been sleeping, which he had, sat beside his client with the expression of someone who had already advised against this conversation and been overruled. Grant looked different in the morning light filtering through the blinds. Not smaller exactly, but reduced. The way a space looks different once you've rearranged the furniture and realize how much of its character depended on what was in it. He'd spent the last several hours in a room with federal agents, and whatever had shifted internally in his office at 4 a.m. had continued shifting, and the man sitting behind the table now was recognizably Grant Mercer, but was no longer the Grant Mercer who had signed safety certifications and attended board meetings and hired Philip Chen 12 years ago. He looked at Adrian when Adrian came in and sat down across from him. The lawyer started to say something, and Grant put a hand up briefly, and the lawyer stopped. "You found everything," Grant said. "Yes. I need you to know—" He stopped. Started again. "The communication interrupt. The remote activation capability. I was never going to use it." The room was very still. "I built it as insurance," Grant said. "If something changed, if the mission profile shifted and the passive trigger wouldn't be enough, I wanted the option." His voice was level, controlled, the voice of an engineer explaining a design choice. "But I was never going to be in a position to use it, because I was going to be in this building at 3 a.m. signing the clearance paperwork with everyone watching me." "So you built it and never planned to use it," Adrian said. "That's what I'm telling you." Adrian looked at him for a moment. "The passive trigger would have killed the crew." "I know. You know." The words came out flat. Not angry. He didn't have the energy for anger right now, and anger wasn't the thing he was feeling anyway. What he was feeling was more like the specific sadness of understanding something completely and wishing he didn't. "You designed a failure sequence that would have killed the people on that aircraft, and you're distinguishing it from a remote activation on the grounds that you personally weren't going to push a button." Grant's jaw tightened. "The distinction matters to me. It probably won't matter much to the people who'll decide what happens to you next." Grant's lawyer put a hand on the table. "Mr. Knox, I think we should—" "I'm done," Adrian said. He looked at Davin. "Is there something specific you needed me to hear, or was this—" "There's more," Davin said. "Mr. Mercer, you were telling me before Mr. Knox arrived." Grant looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet long enough that the silence started to have its own weight. "I didn't build this by myself," he said. "But—" The name Grant gave them was Caldwell, not a Skyforge employee. A name Adrian didn't recognize, and from the look that passed between Davin and Sorensen when Davin relayed it through the open door 40 minutes later, a name they did. Marcus Caldwell. Managing partner of an investment consortium called Vantage Meridian Group, which held a significant short position in Skyforge's publicly traded stock and had been building that position for the better part of 2 years. Grant explained it in the careful, slightly flattened voice of someone who had been through the decision to talk and had come out the other side of it into a kind of hollow clarity. He'd been approached 18 months ago. Not at the office, not through any channel that would appear on a compliance report. At a private dinner that had been arranged through a mutual contact who, Grant said, he now understood had been positioned for exactly that purpose. The pitch had been simple. Skyforge was overextended. The Sentinel program was behind schedule, over budget, and dependent on a contract renewal that the Defense Department was already quietly reconsidering. The company's stock was going to fall. The only question was when. Vantage Meridian had positioned accordingly. If someone inside could ensure that the fall happened in a controlled and predictable way, specifically, if the Sentinel failed its operational deployment in a manner that could be attributed to manufacturing or design flaws rather than sabotage, the short position would pay out at a scale that made 9 years of Skyforge stock options look like a rounding error. Grant had said no. That first time, he had actually said no, and he'd spent 3 weeks afterward telling himself he'd handled it correctly. Then Skyforge had quietly restructured his compensation package in a way that cost him 40% of his projected long-term payout, and the board had passed over him for a seat they'd been informally promising him for 2 years. And Caldwell had reached out again, more precisely this time, with more specific numbers and a cleaner proposal. He said he hadn't meant for anyone to die. He said the plan was for the failure to happen over the test corridor, where the aircraft would be operating without a crew. He said the military had changed the mission profile 6 weeks ago and moved the operational deployment forward on a timeline that hadn't left him room to adjust. He said a lot of things that his lawyer periodically tried to interrupt, and Grant talked through all of them with the consistency of a man who had made a decision in the small hours and was going to live in it now, for better or worse. Adrian sat in the conference room and listened to all of it, and when Grant finished, he sat for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "The aircraft had a crew manifest." Grant looked at him. "The departure authorization listed 5 people," Adrian said. "Mission crew plus 2 observers. Their names were on the manifest I reviewed during the pre-flight documentation check." He kept his voice even. "You signed that manifest, Mr. Mercer." Grant said nothing. "The test corridor flight you're describing, that was the Phase 2 deployment, which was pushed back 8 weeks ago. The mission profile had been updated in the program documents for 2 months. It's in the files your office manages." Adrian looked at him steadily. "You knew there was a crew on that aircraft." The room was very quiet. Grant Mercer looked at the table. His hands were flat against it, and his lawyer had stopped making any move to interrupt. And the silence in the room had the quality of a verdict, even though nothing official had been said. "I know," Grant said finally, to the table, to no one in particular. His voice had lost the careful engineering tone it had held for the last hour. What was underneath it was harder to describe. Not remorse exactly, not yet, but the particular tone of a person who has been constructing a version of events that lets them remain recognizable to themselves, and has just heard something that makes the construction fail. "I know," he said again, and didn't say anything else. Guam. Adrian left the conference room and walked down the east corridor and out the side door of the operations building into the morning air, which was cold and clean and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 9 hours. He stood on the concrete apron for a while. The desert was visible beyond the perimeter fence, flat and brown and enormous, stretching toward a horizon where the sky was fully light now, the sun up but still low, casting the long shadows of early morning across everything. There was no drama in the landscape. It was just the desert, being the desert, which was what it did regardless. He thought about the 5 names on the crew manifest. He didn't know them, hadn't met them, couldn't picture their faces. But they had names, which meant they had people somewhere, people who hadn't known tonight what almost happened, and who wouldn't know now unless someone told them, and who would probably never know the specific chain of events that had stood between them and not coming back. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He wasn't sure there was anything to do with it. He went back inside. The thing about uncovering a conspiracy of this complexity was that it didn't resolve cleanly when the central fact became known. It spread. Each confirmed element generated new questions, new threads, new connections that required documentation and verification in response. And the morning at Delamar Air Complex became an exercise in managing the spread, containing it, directing it, making sure the right pieces went to the right people in the right sequence. Sorensen coordinated with the Federal Program Office. Davin coordinated with her agency's investigative division, which dispatched 2 more agents to the facility by 10 a.m. Tully ran the internal security response and dealt with the ground crew, most of whom had questions they were entitled to ask and answers they were only partially going to get. Victoria managed the board and legal and a communications team that was already drafting the public statement that would eventually, in some form, explain to the outside world why a classified defense deployment had been delayed. Adrian sat at a table in the hangar office and wrote. He wrote the complete technical narrative of what he'd found and in what sequence and how he'd verified it, not the documentation he'd already submitted to Sorensen, which was the factual record, but a separate account in plain language that walked through the technical decisions and what had driven them. It wasn't required. Nobody had asked him for it. He wrote it because he thought it might be useful, and because writing was the way he processed things, and because he had a strong instinct that the clearest account of what had happened to this aircraft should exist somewhere in a form that didn't require a DOD clearance to read. He was 2/3 through it when Chen appeared in the doorway. "Sorensen's ready for the final clearance review," Chen said. "He wants you in the hangar. Tub." The final clearance review was not a ceremony. It was a technical process. Sorensen walking through the verification documentation against a federal checklist, confirming that each system had been inspected, that each finding had been documented, that each repair had been performed according to the relevant specification, and that each repair had been verified against the post-repair baseline. It took 40 minutes. Adrian stood to the side and answered questions when Sorensen had them, which was 4 times, each time about a specific measurement or a verification step in the restoration protocol. He answered precisely and referenced the relevant page in his documentation each time, and Sorensen checked the reference each time, and they moved through the checklist without rushing. When Sorensen reached the last item, he checked it, initialed the page, and closed the binder. "Aircraft systems are verified as restored to specification," he said. He looked at Adrian. "The formal airworthiness certification will come from the program office. That's not my call to make, but I'll tell you my recommendation." He paused. "Airworthy." Something in the room shifted, not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, but with the quiet quality of attention that has been held for a very long time releasing. Victoria, who had come into the hangar during the review and stood at the back of the small group without interrupting, exhaled. It was subtle, so she wouldn't have wanted anyone to notice it. But Adrian was standing at an angle where he could see her, and he noticed. Whitfield, the military program officer, stepped forward and spoke for the first time in an hour. "We'll need the formal certification before we can authorize departure. I'll reach the program office directly." He looked at his watch. "Best case, we're looking at a 6-hour window for the authorization to process." "The crew?" "On standby," Whitfield said. "They've been on standby since I arrived. They'll be briefed." "What are you going to tell them?" Victoria asked. Whitfield considered this with the expression of someone for whom the management of information was a professional specialty. "We'll tell them there was a maintenance finding during a final systems check, that the finding has been resolved, and that the aircraft has been cleared for departure pending formal certification, which is all accurate." "It's also incomplete," Victoria said. "Yes," Whitfield agreed, without apology. "It is. The 6 hours didn't move slowly or quickly. They moved the way time moves inside a large, mostly empty building when the acute crisis has passed, but the situation hasn't fully resolved. Unevenly, with pockets of activity and stretches of waiting, and the particular restlessness of people who need to be present but don't have a specific task. The Vantage Meridian investigation moved fast once Caldwell's name was in play. Sorensen's agency had apparently been building a parallel case against the consortium for over a year. The Skyforge short position wasn't their only operation, and Grant Mercer wasn't the only insider they'd cultivated. And the evidence in the Sentinel sabotage was, from what Davin told Adrian in a brief and slightly unusual moment of directness, the clearest single instance of documented corporate sabotage their division had encountered in a decade. Marcus Caldwell was taken into federal custody at his home at 11:15 a.m., which Adrian learned from a 3-line update Davin sent to the hangar office, and which he received without particular reaction because by that point he was on his second egg sandwich and was deeply focused on his written account, which he was finding harder to complete than he'd expected. Not because of the technical sections. The technical sections came easily. The diagnostic sequence, the findings, the repair process. What was harder was the part near the end, the part where he tried to account for why any of it mattered in terms that didn't sound either self-important or falsely modest. He kept writing and deleting the same few sentences. He'd write something about competence being independent of position, then delete it because it sounded like a LinkedIn post. He'd write something about the cost of dismissing people who know things, then delete it because it was too close to being about him specifically. He'd write something about documentation as a form of protection for the aircraft, protection for the people on it, protection for the person doing the work, and then look at it and think it was getting somewhere real but not quite there yet. He was still working on it when the formal airworthiness certification came through at 2:40 p.m. The announcement went out through the facility over the internal PA system in Whitfield's measured, uninflected voice. Sentinel DX-9 airworthiness certification confirmed by the Federal Defense Program Office. Departure authorization issued. Crew reporting time 1500 hours. In the hangar where a small group had gathered, ground crew, Skyforge technical staff, Tully's security team, a few faces Adrian didn't know. The announcement produced a response that was quieter than a cheer, but louder than silence. Not celebration exactly. Something more like the collective exhale of people who have been holding something for a long time and have been given permission to put it down. Adrian set down his laptop and looked at the aircraft. It was the same aircraft it had been at 10 p.m. the night before, when he'd first crawled underneath it with a pen light and a diagnostic cart and noticed a number that didn't match. Same airframe, same systems, same elegant engineering, but it wasn't the same either because now it was whole in a way it hadn't been. Intact in every system that mattered, documented from nose to tail, verified by someone who had spent the night learning every place where it had been broken and every method by which it could be restored. He didn't know how to feel about that exactly. He felt tired. He felt the particular absence that follows sustained intensity, like the silence after a very loud sound. He felt the slight awkwardness of not knowing what to do with himself now that the thing requiring him to do specific things was over. Philip Chen appeared at his elbow, which seemed to be Chen's mode of operation, materializing at elbows. "She wants to say something," Chen said quietly, "to the team. She asked if you'd stay." I wasn't planning to go anywhere." Chen nodded and retreated, which was also his mode of operation. Victoria gathered this hangar at 3:15, 15 minutes before the crew was due to begin boarding. She stood near the nose of the aircraft, not behind a podium, not in any formal arrangement, just in the hangar with about 30 people arranged in a loose semicircle around her, the way people arrange themselves when something is happening and they're not sure of the protocol. She didn't have notes. She'd had 6 hours to prepare something and she hadn't written anything down, which Adrian suspected was deliberate. She talked for about 4 minutes. She talked about what had been found on the aircraft the previous night, in terms clear enough for the room to understand and vague enough to respect the classified elements. She talked about what it had taken to find it, the inspection, the documentation, the restoration work. She talked about Grant Mercer, briefly and without visible emotion, in the language of someone who had processed the betrayal privately and wasn't going to display the processing publicly because that wasn't who she was. Then she looked at Adrian, who was standing at the edge of the group near the equipment cases where he'd spent part of the night sitting and waiting. "When Mr. Knox came to me last night," she said, "he told me he'd found an anomaly in the pressurization system and that he needed 3 hours to investigate it. I told him he was wrong. I told him the aircraft had been certified and inspected and that his assessment was less reliable than the process that had already been completed." The hangar was quiet. I was the CEO making a decision based on time pressure and assumptions about who was worth listening to. He was a contract technician who had spent 8 months building the classified systems on this aircraft and who noticed a number that didn't match because he'd written the diagnostic protocol that flagged it. She paused. Every single thing that was found last night was found because he didn't accept being told to leave. She kept her eyes on him as she said the next part. "I made a judgment call about someone based on their title and their position on the payroll, and I was wrong about it in a way that could have gotten 5 people killed. That's the honest account." She didn't look away. "I'm sorry, Mr. Knox. Not the company. Me, personally. For dismissing you in front of your colleagues, and for the 40 minutes we lost because I was more interested in protecting my schedule than in hearing what you had to say." The room held the apology for a moment. Adrian looked at her. He thought about 15 years of contract work. The particular kind of invisible that gets built into a career where you're always essential and never permanent, always brought in to fix the difficult things and never quite belonging to the place where the difficult things needed fixing. He thought about the number on the screen that had been wrong and the instinct that had made him look closer and the long night that had followed from that instinct. He said, "Thank you for letting me do the work." It wasn't the speech the moment might have been building toward. It wasn't a gracious acceptance or a larger statement about anything. It was just the true thing. The specific thing that had mattered. The thing that the apology didn't retroactively give him, but that the second chance had. Victoria nodded once, and the look on her face was of someone who had heard the real answer rather than the comfortable one, and respected the difference. Eat. The crew boarded at 15:20. Adrian stood with a group of ground crew and watched the boarding process from the hangar floor. 5 people in flight gear crossing the apron, helmets under their arms, moving with the specific purposefulness of people trained for this. They had been briefed on a maintenance finding and a resolution. They knew the aircraft had been cleared. They didn't know, and might never know, the specific chain of events that had produced those two facts. The boarding ramp retracted. The hangar doors opened fully to the afternoon, letting in a wash of cold desert air and the flat winter light of 3:30 p.m. Ground crew moved back. Clearances were confirmed over radio in the clipped, exact language of operational departure. The engines started. Not a roar, but a rising tone, building from silence into something sustained and purposeful. Adrian watched from inside the hangar line, behind the safety marker, as the Sentinel moved onto the taxiway with a slowness that would eventually become tremendous speed and then altitude and then distance, carrying 5 people in a classified mission and the documented proof that it was whole. He watched until it reached the runway threshold. He watched the pause at the threshold. That specific pause before commitment, the moment between the last chance to turn back and the decision to go. Then the aircraft rolled. It accelerated down the runway with the speed that always surprised him no matter how many times he'd seen it, the way it transformed from a large and heavy thing sitting on concrete into a thing that was no longer subject to the ordinary rules about what stays on the ground. The nose lifted. The wheels left the surface. And then it was up, climbing, angling toward the southeast, getting smaller against the afternoon sky in the way that all aircraft eventually get smaller, until it was a shape and then a point and then nothing visible. The runway was empty. Around him, people started moving. Ground crew to their tasks, support staff back to the operations building, the ordinary business of a facility that had just sent something into the sky and now had to manage all the things that didn't go with it. Adrian stayed where he was for another minute. The sky over the desert was the specific blue of a winter afternoon, deep and clear and cold-looking in a way that didn't prevent the sun from being genuinely warm on the left side of his face where he was standing. In a few hours it would be dark again, and the runway lights would come back on and cut their pale yellow lines across the concrete, and the night shift would start whatever they started on a night when nothing was scheduled, and the big decisions were already made. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be Victoria Hale. It said, "My office Monday, 10 a.m. Bring your documentation and whatever questions you have about a full-time position. VH." He read it twice. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and picked up his kit bag and walked toward the parking lot in the afternoon light, and the desert was where it always was, and the sky was where it always was. And the aircraft was somewhere in it, climbing. He didn't sleep well that Saturday night. This wasn't surprising. His body had been awake for over 20 hours by the time he got back to the extended stay motel on the edge of Delamar Township where Skyforge's contractor housing arrangements had put him for the duration of the program. A room with a window that faced the parking lot and an HVAC unit that cycled on and off with the persistence of something that had been complaining about its situation for years and had given up expecting anyone to listen. He'd eaten a bowl of instant noodles from the gas station across the street because it was the only thing open, and he'd sat on the edge of the bed for a while, looking at nothing in particular. And then he'd lain down and spent most of the dark hours somewhere in the unsatisfying territory between awake and asleep, where the mind keeps reviewing things it has already finished with. He kept coming back to the moment in the conference room when Grant Mercer had said, "I know," to the table, not with any particular heat, not replaying it to feel better about anything, just turning it over, the way you turn over something that doesn't quite fit the category you've assigned it to. Grant Mercer wasn't a monster. That was the uncomfortable part, the part that didn't resolve into anything clean. He was an engineer, a careful one, and a man who had made a calculation that had gone wrong in ways that probably seemed, at the moment of making it, more manageable than they turned out to be. That didn't excuse it. It didn't come close to excusing it, but it made the situation sit differently than it would have if the explanation were simpler. By 5:30 a.m., he'd given up on sleep entirely and was sitting at the small desk by the window with his laptop, reading back through the written account he'd started in the hangar office. He'd submitted the technical documentation to Sorensen. This was the other thing, the plain language account, and he still wasn't sure what he was going to do with it or whether it was for anyone other than himself. He read it through twice, fixed 3 factual errors, and left the ending incomplete because he still hadn't worked out how to write it. Outside, the parking lot was dark, and the motel sign cast a flat orange light across the asphalt. In a few hours, the Sunday would begin in the ordinary way Sundays begin, and none of the people going about their business would know that 40 miles away, the previous night had contained the specific kind of near miss that only becomes a story because someone noticed a number that was off by a fraction. He closed the laptop and went to make coffee in the small machine on the bathroom counter, which produced something hot and theoretically coffee-flavored, and stood at the window, drinking it and watching the parking lot get slowly lighter, and thought about Monday at 10 a.m. The weekend passed. The way weekends pass when you've been through something large and the thing is over, but the processing isn't, in fragments, unevenly. He went for a long walk Saturday afternoon along the road that ran beside the perimeter fence of Delamar Air Complex, not intending to, just finding himself there. The complex looked different in daylight, and without the specific urgency of the previous night. Just a collection of buildings and hangars behind a chain-link fence, ordinary looking in the way that places look ordinary when nothing is happening inside them. He ate a real meal at a diner in town Saturday evening, eggs and toast and coffee that a person had made, and sat at the counter and read a newspaper that was 2 days old, because that was what they had, and felt, incrementally, like someone returning from a distance to ordinary life. Sunday he finished the written account. The ending, when he finally found it, wasn't anything profound. He wrote about the number that had been wrong on the diagnostic screen and what it had required him to do. Not courage, not heroism, not anything that elevated the act beyond what it was. Just the refusal to accept an explanation that didn't account for the data. Just the willingness to stay in a room or under an aircraft or inside a set of evidence until the picture was complete, even when staying was uncomfortable and the people around you wanted you to go. He read it back and it still felt incomplete, but he'd learned enough about writing to understand that incomplete and finished were not mutually exclusive. He saved it to a folder on his desktop and didn't send it to anyone. Monday morning was cold and clear. He drove the 40 miles to Skyforge headquarters, not the air complex, which was its own facility, but the company's main campus in the city, a building he hadn't been inside before because his contract was tied to the aircraft program, and the aircraft program was at the complex. The headquarters building had the particular architectural ambition of a company that had spent money on its public face, glass and steel, and a lobby with high ceilings that made the 2 people at the reception desk look slightly undersized. He gave his name, got a visitor badge, and was told that Ms. Hale's assistant would come down to get him, which the assistant did at 9:58, a young woman named Portia, who moved quickly and efficiently and offered him coffee 3 times in the elevator, each time as if for the first time, which he eventually decided was a nervous habit. Victoria's office was on the top floor, which was not a surprise, and it was large enough to contain a meeting table along one wall and a standing desk along another and a set of floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city in a way that was either inspiring or vertiginous depending on how you felt about heights. She was on the phone when Portia brought him in, held up one finger in the universal signal for 1 more minute, and he sat at the meeting table and looked at the city and waited. She finished the call, set the phone down, and came to the table with a folder and a yellow legal pad on which she'd written several lines in handwriting that was small and precise and difficult to read upside down. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the invitation." But to us sochas. They looked at each other for a moment in the slightly awkward way of people who have been through something significant together and are now in a formal setting that doesn't quite map onto it. "I've been on the phone since Friday afternoon," she said. "The federal program office, the board, legal, the contract renewal team, and a communications consultant who is apparently being paid $400 an hour to tell me things I already know." She opened the folder. "The contract renewal is not in jeopardy. The program office's position is that the incident demonstrates the integrity of our safety systems, that the sabotage was discovered internally before flight through our own inspection process, and that the federal response was prompt and thorough. That's the story they're telling, and it's accurate enough that I'm not going to argue with it." "And Grant?" "Federal custody pending arraignment. His lawyer is apparently constructing something around duress and incomplete intent, which I don't think is going anywhere given what he told Davin on the record. She paused. Caldwell's consortium is under investigation on 4 separate counts. That'll be in the news eventually. Adrian nodded. He'd expected most of this, or versions of it. The board wants to restructure the operations oversight function, she continued. There's no director of operations right now, and there won't be one until a formal review of the certification and maintenance pipeline is complete. Which brings me to why I asked you here. He waited. I want you to run the review, she said, not as a contractor, as a full-time Skyforge employee. The title would be Director of Flight Safety Systems. It's a new role. We're creating it. The scope would be oversight of the entire certification and inspection pipeline for the Sentinel program and any subsequent defense contracts, with authority to halt any flight or departure on safety grounds without requiring executive approval. He was quiet for a moment. Without requiring executive approval, he said. Yes. She said it without flinching. That condition is non-negotiable from my end. I'm not in a position after Friday night to create a role that can be overruled by the CEO's schedule. She held his gaze. That means it can be overruled by me. If I disagree with a call you make, we'll have that disagreement on the record with full documentation, and it'll be resolved through the Federal Program Office if necessary. But the default authority rests with the safety director. He sat with this for a moment. Outside the windows, the city moved through its Monday morning. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary large-scale business of people doing things. I want to read the formal job description before I commit to anything, he said. That's reasonable. And I want the documentation protocols from Friday night incorporated into the standing procedure for any classified systems inspection. What I built over the course of that evening, the photograph sequence, the cross-referencing methodology, the plain language narrative alongside the technical record, I want that to be the standard, not a one-time thing. She picked up her pen and wrote something on the legal pad. Done. And I want the inspector's initials verification built into the certification checklist. The forgery on page 47 of that certification binder should have been caught by a procedural check. It wasn't because the procedure didn't require independent verification of signatory consistency across a document. He'd been thinking about this since Saturday morning. A second reviewer looking for consistency across signatures adds maybe 20 minutes to a certification review. It's worth 20 minutes. She wrote it down without commenting on whether it was a reasonable request, which told him something about the person she was trying to be in this meeting versus the person she'd been at the observation deck window on Friday night. Anything else? She said. Not today. He looked at her. Can I ask you something? Yes. Did you already know you were going to offer me this before I came in? She considered whether to answer honestly. He could see her decide. Yes, she said. I decided Saturday morning. What changed between Friday afternoon and Saturday morning? She set the pen down. On Friday afternoon, you were a contractor who had just had a difficult night and done his job well. That was the category I had for you. She looked at him directly. Saturday morning, I read your full documentation package. Not the summary. The complete package. Every photograph, every log cross-reference, every notation including the ones where you'd flagged your own judgment calls and the moments where you were uncertain. She paused. You documented your own uncertainty. I've had senior staff members in this building for 12 years who would never in 1,000 years put a question mark next to their own decisions in an official record. It's just accurate, he said. I know. That's why I read it twice. She picked up the pen again. The formal offer will come through HR by end of day. Standard review period is 2 weeks, but I'd like an answer by Friday if you're willing. He was in the elevator going down when his phone rang. It was Garrett Tully, which was unexpected. He and Tully had exchanged maybe 40 words on Friday night, and none since. Knox, got a minute? I'm in an elevator. Give me 30 seconds. The lobby materialized around him, and he stepped to one side of the reception desk to take the call. Davin's team found something this morning, Tully said. His voice had the specific flatness it had in the hangar. Professional, containing rather than communicating. In Grant's office, files he hadn't gotten rid of. What kind of files? Documentation of his work on the comm interrupt, technical notes, Component sourcing records, timeline. Tully paused. There's a section about you specifically. Adrian went still. He'd been tracking you, Tully said. Your contract history, your access records, your role in the DoD integration work. He knew you were the Level 3 authorization for the classified systems. He knew before Friday night that if anyone was going to find what he'd built into that aircraft, it was you. The lobby moved around him. Two people walked past talking about something unrelated, which was suddenly and briefly startling in the way the ordinary world is startling when you've just received extraordinary information. He knew, Adrian said. He knew. The files include a contingency plan. If the anomaly was flagged before departure, the plan was to have you removed from the facility on a security pretext, tampered authorization paperwork. The documentation was ready to go. He was going to say you'd violated the access protocol. Adrian understood, slowly and fully, the shape of what he was hearing. Grant had known that Adrian was the person most likely to find the sabotage. The dismissal that Victoria had ordered hadn't been entirely Victoria's idea. It had been fed to a moment that Grant had anticipated and had a plan to extend. If the maintenance flag had gone through normal channels, if Adrian had been walked out of the facility on a security violation rather than recalled by a federal phone call, the falsified authorization paperwork would have been waiting. An accusation on paper, a name associated with a security breach, the person who might have found the sabotage, discredited before finding it. He would have framed me, Adrian said. It came out quiet. Not a question. That was the contingency, Tully said. It didn't get used because the federal call came through too fast. But it was there. Adrian stood in the Skyforge lobby for a moment with the phone against his ear and the visitor badge still clipped to his jacket. The federal call, he said. How did the federal liaison know to call when he did? That one's interesting, Tully said, and something in his voice shifted slightly. Davin looked into it. The federal liaison, Sorensen's division, had already been monitoring the Sentinel program for 3 months. They'd picked up financial irregularities in the Skyforge stock data that connected to the Vantage Meridian short position. They were building a case. He paused. Your maintenance flag hit the program office system the second you radioed hangar control. It was time-stamped and logged automatically. Sorensen's team saw it. They called because I logged the flag. They called because you logged the flag, and because the flag was the first concrete on-site evidence they had that whatever they'd been watching from the financial side had moved into the physical aircraft. Tully paused again. If you hadn't logged it, if you'd just gone back to Victoria verbally without putting it in the system, they might not have called for hours, maybe not until after departure. Adrian thought about the habit his mentor had given him 15 years ago, said in a voice that didn't invite argument. Always write down when you said something. Not for them. For you. The note he typed at 10:47 p.m. while sitting on an equipment case near the far wall of the hangar after being dismissed, when he'd had no particular reason to believe anyone was watching or that the logging would matter. Flagged, dismissed, no action taken, 22:47. 3 words and a timestamp that had gone into a federal monitoring system and pulled a phone call that had changed everything. He didn't know what to do with the full weight of that. He wasn't sure the full weight of it was something a person could carry all at once. Thank you for telling me, he said to Tully. Thought you should know the whole picture, Tully said. Good luck with whatever comes next. And he hung up, which was the most Tully thing possible to do. He drove back toward Delamar without music, which was unusual for him on long drives. He just drove and let the city give way to the highway and the highway give way to the flat, wide-open landscape he'd been living alongside for the past 3 months of the contract without paying it much attention. It was different in the winter morning light than it was at night. Not empty exactly, but honest in its emptiness, not pretending to be more than it was. He thought about the job offer. The shape of it was right. The authority, the documentation requirements, the non-negotiability of the safety director's independence. Those weren't things he'd expected, and they weren't things he'd have designed differently. Victoria had thought about what she was offering, not just what she needed. That was something. What he was less sure about was himself in the role, not the technical part. He knew the work, he could do the work. He'd been doing versions of it for 15 years. What he was less sure about was the other part, the permanent part. The part where you put your name on a door and attend meetings and become, over time, the kind of person who can be pressured on schedule rather than hired on contract. He'd built his career in the contract structure deliberately, not because of a lack of options, but because the independence had seemed worth what it cost. The lack of permanence, the housing in whatever motel the client chose, the constant motion from one program to the next, the motel with the complaining HVAC unit, the gas station noodles, the 2-day-old newspaper at the diner counter. He let himself look at those things honestly. He was 38. He'd been doing this for 15 years and was good at it, and the goodness at it was real and not something he was going to undervalue, but the structure it lived in had been built for a younger version of himself who had reasons for the mobility that no longer applied in the same way. He wasn't sure when that had changed. He suspected it had changed gradually in the way most things change, and he simply hadn't updated his account of himself to reflect it. He pulled off the highway at a rest stop, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to sit still for a minute outside the car. The rest stop was a parking lot with some picnic tables and a view of the desert that extended without interruption to where the mountains cut the sky. It was cold enough that he could see his breath. There was one other car in the lot, and its occupant appeared to be asleep, which seemed like a reasonable thing to be. He sat on a picnic table and thought about the Level 3 authorization. His name on a document that nobody in that facility had thought to mention until a federal phone call made it relevant. 8 months of integration work that had disappeared into the classified record, that had made him essential without making him visible. That had been the specific reason the aircraft hadn't taken off on Friday night, while it was still broken. There was a version of his career where that invisibility was just the price of the work, where the work was sufficient and the recognition was irrelevant and the contract structure was fine because the contracts kept coming and the work kept being good. He told himself that version for a long time. He'd believed it, mostly. The job offer wasn't recognition. He didn't think that's what Victoria was offering, and even if it had been, recognition wasn't what he'd wanted out of Friday night. What he'd wanted was for the aircraft not to take off while it was broken, and that had happened. What the job offer was permanence, a place, an authority that was documented rather than assumed, visible rather than buried in classified integration records. The difference between being the person everyone needed when the crisis arrived and being the person who could stop the crisis from arriving. He sat with that for a while. The desert didn't offer an opinion, which was something he'd always appreciated about deserts. He texted Victoria at 2:15 p.m. from the motel parking lot, which felt slightly informal given the conversation they'd had that morning, but the text was brief and the informality seemed appropriate for its content. I'll have an answer by Wednesday. Want to go through the formal offer and have a few more questions. Knox. Her response came back in 4 minutes. Wednesday works. Portia will set it up. He went inside and changed out of the clothes he'd worn to the meeting, which was a relief, and made the bathroom coffee, which wasn't, and sat at the small desk and opened the incomplete written account on his laptop. He read the ending again. The part he'd left incomplete because he hadn't found the right language for it. He sat there for a while. Then he started typing. He wrote about the 15 years. Not chronologically, not as a resume. More the accumulated understanding of a career spent doing necessary work in the margins of organizations that always needed him and never quite knew where to put him. The contract structure that had felt like freedom and had been, in some ways, but had also been a kind of permanent distance from any stake in what happened next. The motion. The motel rooms. The expertise that was real and complete and almost entirely invisible until something went wrong. He wrote about what it meant to document. Not just technically, not just the photographs and the log entries and the cross-references, but the act itself. The decision to make a record of what you observed and what you did and why you did it, even when nobody was asking. Especially when nobody was asking. The way documentation was a form of believing that what you saw was real, that what you did mattered, that the gap between what you knew and what was officially known could be closed if you were precise enough and persistent enough and refused to accept ambiguity as a terminal condition. He wrote about the number that had been wrong. He wrote about sitting on the equipment case with his phone in his hands, after being dismissed, writing a 3-word note and a timestamp into the void for no particular audience, on the off chance that the record would matter someday. He wrote about the phone call that note had pulled. He didn't write about Grant Mercer except briefly because Grant's accounting belonged to other people and other processes, and what Adrian was trying to account for was something different. He was trying to account for the shape of a life built around doing something well in rooms where well was not always the thing being measured. The ending, when it finally came, was shorter than he expected. He wrote, "I don't know if I'll take the job. I know I'll keep the habit. The record is the thing. It was always the thing. Everything else followed from it." He read it back. It still felt incomplete. He decided that was fine. He saved the document, closed the laptop, and lay down on the bed and fell asleep before 5 p.m., which was the most straightforwardly human thing he'd done in 4 days. And when the HVAC unit cycled on with its familiar complaint, he didn't hear it at all. Wednesday came gray and cold, with a wind off the desert that had an opinion about being outside. Adrian drove to Skyforge headquarters again and went through the same lobby with a different visitor badge and was taken to the same floor by Portia, who offered him coffee twice in the elevator this time rather than 3, which represented some kind of progress. He'd spent Tuesday going through the formal offer document with the patients he brought to technical documentation, every clause, every definition, every specification of authority and scope and exception. He'd written 12 questions in the margin and crossed out 8 of them when he found the answers in subsequent sections. The remaining 4 he brought with him in a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. Victoria was at the meeting table this time, rather than the phone when he came in, which felt like a different kind of conversation from the start. They went through the questions. 3 of them resolved simply. Points of clarification that the HR language had obscured, but that the underlying intent was clear on once she explained it. The 4th was harder. Scope of authority for aircraft that aren't in the Sentinel program, he said. The offer limits the safety director role to defense contract aircraft. What happens if there's a safety concern on a commercial or test platform? Flag it to the program director for that platform, she said. And if the program director has a departure window and a financial incentive to move the aircraft? She looked at him. I'm asking because I'd like the answer to be different from what it was on Friday night, he said, without heat. She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer is that the authority structure for non-defense platforms is different, and I can't unilaterally change it through this appointment. She paused. What I can do is establish a company-wide protocol that any employee, regardless of title or employment status, can formally document a safety concern through the Federal Program Office without going through internal channels. A direct reporting path. That protects the person making the flag. Yes. It doesn't guarantee the flag gets acted on. No, she said. It doesn't. I can't guarantee that. What I can do is make the record clear so that if something goes wrong after a flag is ignored, the accountability is unambiguous. She held his gaze. That's the honest version of what I can offer. He respected that more than a cleaner answer would have been. All right, he said. She looked at him. Is that a yes? He took the folded piece of paper from his jacket, which had the 4 questions on it, and set it on the table, which was not an answer but was something. I want to start by redoing the entire certification pipeline review for the Sentinel program, he said. Not because I expect to find anything, because I want to understand every point where the process could be gamed, and I want to build the checks in before there's a reason to need them. How long will that take? 6 weeks? Maybe 8? The program office will want to be involved. Good. I want them involved. Independent eyes on every step. He looked at her. If that's acceptable, then yes. Something in her face relaxed very slightly in the way that faces do when a thing that has been uncertain becomes certain. It's acceptable, she said. They shook hands across the table, which felt formal in a way that also felt right. The way things feel right when they've been arrived at honestly and without shortcuts. He left the building at 11:40 a.m. with the signed offer letter in his jacket pocket and the visitor badge surrendered at the front desk. And when he pushed through the lobby doors into the cold gray morning, he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the wind have its opinion about him and thought about what came next. What came next was the work. It was always the work. The inspection, the documentation, the cross-references, The careful, patient building of a record that said what was true and accounted for what was uncertain and refused to stop at an explanation that didn't cover the data. The work didn't change because the title changed. What changed was where he stood when he did it, and who bore responsibility for what happened when he found something wrong. He walked to his car. The city moved around him with its ordinary Monday urgency. People going places, not going places, buying coffee, talking on phones, inhabiting the normal world that ran alongside all of this and would keep running alongside whatever came next. The Sentinel was somewhere out there in the classified record, having completed its mission, and 5 people had come back from it without knowing what had almost happened, and the documentation of what Adrian Knox had done on a November night at Delamar Air Complex was sitting in a federal file and in his own laptop and in the memory of the people who had been present for it. He started the car. The heat came on, gradually, working toward warm. He pulled out of the parking garage and into the street and pointed toward the highway, and the gray sky sat over the city and over the desert beyond it and over everything. The same sky it had always been, indifferent and enormous and entirely unimpressed, which was exactly right. The certification pipeline review took 7 weeks. Adrian started on his first official Monday as Director of Flight Safety Systems by doing something that surprised Portia, who had apparently expected him to spend the first week in meetings. He went back to Hangar 7 at Delamar Air Complex, put on a work jacket, and started reading documentation from the beginning. Not the Sentinel program specifically, the whole pipeline, going back 3 years, every certification binder, every inspection log, every maintenance record that had passed through Grant Mercer's operational chain. He wasn't looking for more sabotage. He didn't expect to find it. What he was looking for was the shape of the system, where it was strong, where it was built on assumptions that nobody had written down, where the gaps were that a person with knowledge and patience could slip something through if they wanted to. You couldn't build a better process without understanding the existing one from the inside, and you couldn't understand it from the inside by reading summaries. So he read the primary sources, all of them, and he wrote notes in the margins of a legal pad, and he spent his lunch breaks alone at a folding table in a corner of the hangar with a sandwich and his notes, and the ground crew left him alone because they understood what he was doing, even if they didn't know the specific details. In the way that people who work with their hands understand someone else working with their hands, even when the medium is different. Flores, the inventory tech who'd retrieved the authorized replacement component on the night of the sabotage, brought him coffee on the 3rd day without being asked and without making any comment about it, which Adrian took as a form of welcome that was more genuine than anything a formal onboarding process might have produced. By the end of the 2nd week, he had a clear picture of where the process had been vulnerable. By the end of the 4th, he'd drafted the first version of the new protocol. By the end of the 7th, the protocol had been through 2 rounds of revision with the Federal Program Office, reviewed by Sorensen personally, and approved for implementation across all Skyforge defense platforms. It was 53 pages long. It included, among other things, the dual reviewer signature verification he'd identified at the Monday meeting with Victoria, the complete documentation methodology from the night of November 8th, and a direct federal reporting pathway for any safety flag that wasn't actioned within 4 hours of submission. It was thorough and specific and not particularly interesting to read unless you cared about what it was for, which Adrian did, and which was enough. He submitted the final version on a Friday afternoon and drove back to the city in the dark, and somewhere on the highway he realized he'd stopped thinking of the motel as where he was staying. He'd signed a lease on an apartment in the city 3 weeks into the job, a 2nd-floor unit in a building that had trees in front of it and a coffee shop 2 blocks away that was open at 6 a.m. and didn't play music he found annoying. He'd bought a kitchen table. These were small facts, but they were the kind of small facts that accumulate into something larger, and he was aware of them in the way you're aware of a change in weather. Not dramatic, just real. Grant Mercer's arraignment happened on a Tuesday in December, 6 weeks after the night at Delamar. Adrian didn't attend. He wasn't required to, and he didn't have anything to add to what was already in the documentary record, which was thorough enough that his physical presence in a courtroom would have been redundant. He followed the reporting on his phone between meetings and read the charge list: 3 federal counts related to aircraft sabotage, 2 relating to securities fraud in connection with the Vantage Meridian short position, 1 count of conspiracy, with the particular flatness of reading about something you were present for at the beginning and are now watching reach its institutional conclusion. Grant entered a not guilty plea, which his lawyer had presumably advised, and which meant there would be a trial that was expected to begin sometime in the late spring. Marcus Caldwell, whose name was now public, had done the same. The Vantage Meridian investigation had expanded to include 2 other companies and 3 other insiders, which had produced a news cycle that lasted about 10 days before something else replaced it. Victoria had put out a statement at the time of the arraignment, carefully worded, factually accurate, saying nothing that wasn't already in the public record, and nothing that would prejudice the proceedings. Adrian had seen a draft of it and made one suggested edit, which was to remove a line that described Skyforge's response to the incident as swift and decisive, on the grounds that a response that had initially sent the person who found the problem away from the aircraft was neither swift nor decisive, and that describing it that way would read, to anyone who knew the sequence of events, as revisionist. Victoria had removed the line without argument, which was the right call, and the statement that went out was cleaner for the absence of it. What Adrian thought about on the Tuesday of the arraignment wasn't the charges or the plea, or the legal machinery now moving at its own pace toward whatever conclusion it reached. He thought about the 9 years. Grant's 9 years at Skyforge, the certifications signed, the processes built, the people hired, the real work done before whatever combination of resentment and opportunity and bad calculation had led to the night at Delamar. None of that work disappeared because of what came after it. It was still there in the company's history, in the processes that Adrian was now reviewing and revising, some of which Grant had built well, and that deserved to be kept. That was the uncomfortable truth that didn't fit the simpler version of the story, that the person who had done this thing was also, for most of his career, a person who had done genuine and competent work. That these 2 things existed in the same biography. That the line between them wasn't a personality difference or a character type, but a set of decisions made under a specific combination of pressures, and that the decisions had been wrong in ways that couldn't be undone by any amount of prior correctness. Adrian had spent a lot of his career watching institutions treat people as either entirely trustworthy or entirely suspect, with no category for the more common reality, which was that most people were capable of both good work and bad decisions, and that the job of a process was to make the good work possible and make the bad decisions visible before they became catastrophic. That was what the 53-page protocol was for, not to catch villains, to build a system where the consequences of any individual decision, good or bad, were documented and traceable and accountable. He was still thinking about this, more or less, when his phone rang and it was Davin. "Trial date is set," she said without preamble. "March 14th for Mercer. Caldwell's is separate, probably late April. You'll be called as a technical witness for both." I expected that. "I wanted to give you some lead time." A pause. "Your documentation package is going to be the spine of the prosecution case for Mercer. The photographs, the log analysis, the restoration protocol records. Opposing counsel will try to challenge the methodology." "They can challenge it," Adrian said. "The methodology is sound. I documented where I was uncertain as well as where I was certain. It's a complete record." "That's actually what makes it strong," Davin said, and he could hear in her voice the slight surprise of someone who had been expecting to reassure him and found it wasn't necessary. "Prosecution loves a witness who has already accounted for his own limitations. Makes it very hard to introduce doubt that isn't already addressed." "I wasn't trying to be prosecution-friendly," he said. "I was trying to be accurate." "I know," she said. "That's why it works." Another pause. "Anything you need from us before the holidays?" "Not right now. I'll reach out before the new year." He hung up and sat at his desk. A real desk now, in a real office on the operations floor at Skyforge headquarters, with his name on a placard beside the door that he still found slightly startling when he noticed it, and looked out the window at the city in December, which was doing what cities do in December, stringing lights, moving faster, trying to outrun the dark that came earlier every afternoon. The all-hands meeting happened on the second Friday in December, 3 days before the holiday break. It was a Skyforge tradition. Victoria had apparently started it in the company's 3rd year, when the staff had been small enough to fit in one conference room, and the tradition had outlasted the room's capacity by about 400 people. The current version happened in the main atrium of the headquarters building, which could hold most of the company if people were willing to stand, and most people were. The operations staff from Delamar came in for it, a fleet of chartered vans arriving in the parking garage at 9 a.m., mechanics and inspection techs and ground crew in the headquarters building in work jackets among the office staff in their business casual, an annual collision of the two halves of the company that everyone seemed to find either energizing or slightly uncomfortable, depending on their disposition. Adrian stood near the back with Flores and a structural inspector named Park, who he'd been working alongside at the complex and who had the particular quality of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by very little. He'd spoken with Park regularly over the past 7 weeks and trusted her technical judgment and found her company uncomplicated, which were the 3 things he most valued in a colleague. Victoria spoke for about 20 minutes. She talked about the year, the contracts, the milestones, the Sentinel deployment, the things that had gone well. She talked about what had happened in November in terms that were careful and honest and didn't flatten the difficulty of it into a triumph narrative. She talked about what the company was going to do differently, procedurally, and what the new safety director role was intended to accomplish. And she said Adrian's name in a way that was matter-of-fact rather than performative, which was exactly the way he'd have wanted it said. Then she said something that he hadn't expected. "I want to say something that isn't in the prepared remarks," she said, and the atrium, which had been listening with the polite attention of a large group in a mandatory meeting, shifted slightly into something more alert. On the night of November 8th, a contract technician came to me with a safety concern. He was on the aircraft for 40 minutes. He found something that 3 full certification cycles had missed. He came to tell me, and I sent him away because I had a schedule to protect, and I had a set of assumptions about who was worth listening to that were wrong. She paused. He didn't escalate. He didn't argue. He went and sat on a crate in the corner of the hangar and waited, because he understood that being right about something doesn't give you the right to force anyone to listen. He waited until the situation gave him another opening, and then he went back to work. The atrium was quiet. "I've been in this industry for 22 years, she said. "I have never been more directly wrong about a more important thing at a more consequential moment. And the reason it didn't become a catastrophe isn't that the system caught it. The system missed it completely. The reason it didn't become a catastrophe is that one person refused to leave a piece of wrong data unexplained." She looked out at the room. "I don't know how to build a policy around that. I don't know how to put it in a protocol. What I know is that this company is going to spend the next year making sure that the people who notice things have somewhere to put what they notice, and that putting it there doesn't cost them anything." She stopped. The atrium held the silence for a moment. Then the applause started somewhere near the front and moved backward through the room, and Adrian stood at the back near the wall and felt it wash over him and past him, and he didn't know quite what to do with his hands. Park beside him said quietly, "You going to say something?" "I wasn't asked to say anything." "You don't need to be asked." He looked at her. She had the expression of someone who had a clear opinion and wasn't going to repeat it. He looked back at the front of the room, where Victoria was acknowledging the applause with the slightly uncomfortable grace of someone who is not entirely sure the response is proportionate, and where 400 people were still clapping, and where, somewhere in the crowd, Flores was probably doing the same. He thought about what he would say if he said something. He thought about the number that had been wrong, the pen light and the laptop and the rolling cart and the access panel in Sector 4, the note at 10:47 p.m., the federal phone call, the long night, the 53-page protocol, the kitchen table in the coffee shop 2 blocks from the apartment, the name on the door placard. What he would say was probably this, that he hadn't done anything that couldn't have been done by anyone with the right knowledge and the willingness to stay. That the willingness to stay was the whole thing, not the expertise, or not only the expertise, but the decision to remain in a room with a problem until the problem was understood, even when the room was uncomfortable and the people in it wanted you to leave. That this was not a remarkable quality, that it was just the baseline of doing work honestly, and that the reason it had seemed remarkable was that the baseline had been set so low for so long that clearing it looked like something exceptional. That was what he would say. He didn't say it. What he said, when the applause had settled and Victoria had stepped back from the podium and the meeting was moving into its holiday party phase with the specific relieved energy of a large group released from formality, was nothing. He stayed where he was near the back wall and accepted a glass of something sparkling from a passing tray and talked with Flores about the new fuel system logging procedure they were implementing after the new year, and with Park about a minor pressurization anomaly she'd flagged on one of the test platforms that turned out to be exactly what it looked like. Sensor drift, actual sensor drift, the mundane reality that most anomalies are, and with a few other people from the complex whose names he was still learning. Later, when the atrium had thinned out and the catering staff were collecting glasses and the remaining groups were small and scattered, Victoria found him by the far window. She had a glass of water and the look of someone who had been managing a room for 2 hours and was ready to stop. "You didn't say anything," she said. "You didn't ask me to." "Park told me she encouraged you to." "Park has strong opinions." "Park is usually right." Victoria looked out at the room. "Was there something you wanted to say?" He considered it honestly. "Yes and no," he said. "There was something I thought about saying. I decided it could stay unsaid." "What was it?" He told her briefly. The version about the baseline, about the willingness to stay, about the fact that it wasn't remarkable unless remarkable had been redefined downward. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing," she said. "I know. I just didn't need to say it in front of 400 people." She looked at him with the expression she'd had at the meeting table on that first Monday, the look of someone hearing the real answer rather than the comfortable one. "Fair enough," she said. They stood there for a moment in the thinning atrium, the December city visible through the window behind them, doing its annual business of lights and motion and the specific human effort to make the dark season feel warmer than it was. "The protocol goes live January 5th, he said. "I know. Legal confirmed this morning. Sorensen's office wants a joint training session for the inspection teams before the end of January. I'd like you to attend part of it." She raised an eyebrow. "The CEO at a technician training session. Not to demonstrate anything, just to be in the room." He looked at her. "It sends a message about what kind of information matters and where it comes from. That's harder to put in a protocol than a signature check." She thought about this. "All right," she said. "Send me the date, Bob." March came, and with it, the trial. Adrian testified on the second day, which was a Tuesday, in a federal courtroom that was smaller and less dramatic than courtrooms in television shows, and larger and more formal than any room he'd testified in before, which was one room, a NTSB hearing on a component failure 6 years ago that had been resolved before it became a legal proceeding. The prosecutor walked him through the technical documentation in sequence. He answered each question precisely and without embellishment, referenced the relevant exhibit number each time, and when the prosecutor asked him to explain technical concepts for the jury, he did so in plain language that he'd thought about in advance and tested on Flores, who had a gift for telling him when something was comprehensible and when it wasn't. On cross-examination, opposing counsel spent 40 minutes trying to introduce uncertainty into the documentation methodology. Could the communication log gap have been caused by a system error? Could the component discrepancy on page 47 have been a legitimate replacement that was incorrectly logged? Could the hardware chip data be misread? Adrian answered each question the same way. He explained what the evidence showed, what alternative explanations he'd considered, and why they didn't account for the complete data set, and where, specifically, he'd noted uncertainty in his own documentation. He'd written down the judgment call about the fuel system's secondary logs. He'd noted, in the restoration protocol record, 2 steps where he'd had to make a procedural interpretation because the classified specification was ambiguous. Those notations were in the exhibits. He pointed to them himself, which apparently was not what opposing counsel had expected. The cross-examination ended earlier than scheduled. He left the courtroom at noon and walked 2 blocks to a sandwich place and ate lunch alone at a counter stool and thought about nothing particular, which was a skill he'd been working on and was getting incrementally better at. Grant Mercer was convicted on all counts in late March. The sentencing was set for summer. Adrian followed the verdict notification on his phone between a protocol review meeting and a call with the federal program office. And when the call was over and the meeting was done, he sat at his desk for a few minutes and looked at the city and thought about what, if anything, he felt. What he felt was something quieter than satisfaction and more complicated than relief. He felt the specific finality of a thing that has been moving for a long time, reaching its endpoint. Not triumphant, because triumph required an opponent, and Grant Mercer wasn't what he thought of as an opponent, just a person who had made decisions that led here, through a chain of cause and effect that was now fully documented and fully accounted for. He felt tired in a way that was different from the tiredness of the night at Delamar, that had been the tiredness of sustained physical and mental effort. This was the tiredness of a long story reaching its end, the kind of tired you feel when you've been carrying something for a while and have finally been allowed to set it down. He set it down. In April, the Sentinel program was formally renewed for a second phase, which was announced in a press release that mentioned Skyforge's robust safety infrastructure and demonstrated commitment to federal program integrity. Adrian read the press release, which Portia sent him as a matter of routine, and noted that the language was the kind of language that press releases use and didn't dwell on it. What the press release didn't mention, because press releases don't mention this kind of thing, was that 3 weeks earlier, Adrian had flagged a minor discrepancy in the torque specifications on a secondary hydraulic coupling in the second Sentinel aircraft, the DX-9 sister platform, already in advanced production. The discrepancy was not sabotage. It was a genuine specification error, the kind that happens in complex engineering when a component is updated and the documentation doesn't propagate correctly through the entire spec tree, and it would have been caught eventually by the normal certification process, probably. He caught it 6 weeks before it would have reached the certification stage, which meant the correction cost 3 days of production time instead of the 10 it would have cost later, plus no questions from the Federal Program Office about why a spec error had survived certification review. He wrote it up in the documentation log as a routine finding and closed it out the same day. That was the work. Not the dramatic version. The dramatic version happened once, on a November night, and he'd lived through it and documented it and testified about it and didn't need to dramatize it further. The daily version was the specification tree and the log discrepancy, and the Tuesday afternoon spent cross-referencing a component database that nobody else wanted to read. The daily version was unglamorous and specific and absolutely necessary, and it was what he did, and he was good at it, and that was enough. He thought sometimes about what he'd told Victoria in the atrium in December, the thing about the baseline, the willingness to stay. He thought about it most often, not in the big moments, but in the small ones. Sitting at his desk at 7 a.m. with a coffee from the shop 2 blocks away, reading through documentation that most people in the building would never look at, the inspection report that came back clean and had to be verified anyway, the flag that turned out to be sensor drift and had to be followed up anyway, the 10 minutes at the end of every day when he updated the running log of open items, the things being monitored, the things not yet resolved. None of it was remarkable. That was the point. The remarkable thing had happened because the unremarkable thing had already been happening for 15 years, quietly and without recognition, building the knowledge and the habits and the instinct for wrongness that made the difference on a November night when a number didn't match. You don't get the dramatic moment without the long preparation that preceded it, and the long preparation doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a man with a pen light and a laptop who knows what the numbers are supposed to say. He understood now, in a way he hadn't entirely at the beginning, why his mentor had given him the logging habit, not for the dramatic situations, those were rare. For the ordinary ones, the ones where nothing was wrong yet and the record existed anyway, building the baseline against which wrongness would eventually be visible. The record wasn't evidence of anything specific until something needed to be evidenced. Then it was everything. He thought about the 5 names on the crew manifest. He still didn't know them, had made no effort to find out, had decided at some point that the effort would be more about his own need to give the abstract something human than about any genuine connection available to him. But they were somewhere, came back from the mission, lived their lives, did whatever the people who came back from classified military deployments do after. They didn't know. They would probably never know. And that was exactly the right outcome, the one the whole night had been aimed at producing. An event that didn't happen. A disaster that wasn't. 5 people who went and came back and never had to carry the weight of knowing how close it had been. The invisibility of a problem prevented was the whole goal. You didn't get credit for what didn't happen. You got to live with the knowledge that it didn't happen because you were there and you were paying attention and you refused to accept a wrong number as an answer. That was enough. It had always been enough. He finished the coffee and opened the day's documentation queue and started reading, in the particular early morning quiet of an office building where he was one of the first people in. And outside the window, the city was doing what cities do at that hour, waking slowly, filling in, becoming itself again for another day. And the sky above it was the beginning of another ordinary morning, which was the best kind. The protocol training session happened on a Thursday in late January in a conference room at Delamar Air Complex that had been cleared of its usual clutter of binders and equipment manifests and set up with a projector and 12 chairs arranged in a loose rectangle rather than the lecture-style rows that formal training sessions usually used. Adrian had requested the rectangle specifically. He wanted the session to feel like a working conversation rather than a presentation, because the difference between those two things was, in his experience, the difference between people remembering something and people forgetting it the moment they walked out. 11 people came. 6 from the inspection team, 2 from the certification documentation side, Flores from Inventory Park, and 1 person Adrian hadn't expected, Philip Chen. Chen had survived the November reorganization. His role had been restructured, his responsibilities shifted, but he was still at Skyforge, still occupying the slightly hunted expression of a man whose job required him to sit between competing pressures. He'd asked to attend the training through Porsche, which was an unusual channel for a VP, and Adrian had said yes without making anything of it. Victoria arrived 12 minutes late, which was earlier than Adrian had expected, and sat in the remaining chair without ceremony. Nobody reacted dramatically to the CEO sitting in a safety protocol training session, which meant either that people were very professionally composed or that the all-hands speech in December had done something real to the company's internal sense of what mattered and who showed up for it. Adrian suspected the latter, but didn't say so. He ran the session for 2.5 hours. He started with the documentation methodology, not as a rule to be followed, but as a way of thinking about what a record was for. He told them that the most important entry in any safety log was the one written when nothing was wrong yet, because that entry was the baseline against which everything else would eventually be measured. He told them about the logging habit his mentor had given him, the specifics of it. Write down when you said something, write down what you saw, write down what you weren't sure about. And he told them why it mattered in terms of the specific case they all already knew about, without dramatizing it, just tracing the chain from the 1047 timestamp to the federal phone call that the timestamp had pulled. Some of them had been in the hangar that night. Park had been there, doing exterior walk-around inspections while Adrian was underneath the aircraft. Flores had been there, managing inventory. They'd known something serious was happening without knowing its full shape until afterward. Hearing it laid out now, in the training context, produced a particular kind of attention in the room, the attention of people who had been adjacent to something and were now understanding it more completely. The timestamp, Park said at one point. You logged the flag in the system before you came back to the aircraft. Yes. Before you knew whether the flag mattered. The flag always mattered, Adrian said. Whether it turned out to be something serious or sensor drift, the flag needed to be in the system the moment I identified it. That's the rule. You log what you see when you see it, not after you've confirmed it's significant. By the time you've confirmed it's significant, you've already lost the documentation of the moment you first noticed. Park wrote something down. The inspector across from her did the same. Chen, who had been quiet for most of the session, said from the end of the table, "What do you do when you log something and nothing happens? When the flag goes in and it gets reviewed and cleared and nothing comes of it?" It was a good question, and the room recognized it as one. There was a small shift in posture, a collective leaning in. "You log the next thing," Adrian said. "That's it. The flag doesn't have to produce a result to be worth logging. Most of them won't. Most anomalies are what the automated systems say they are. Sensor drift, calibration artifacts, nothing. The log isn't there to catch problems every time. It's there so that when something is a problem, the chain is complete." Chen nodded slowly. He had the expression of someone reconciling this with something he'd been telling himself for a long time. In November, Chen said carefully, when Mr. Knox came to Victoria with the pressurization flag, I was in that room. I told him the aircraft had been certified. He looked at the table for a moment. I was trying to manage the situation. I thought that was my job. The room was quiet. It was part of your job, Adrian said. The managing part. It just wasn't the whole job. He paused. The flag and the schedule were both real. The mistake was treating them as mutually exclusive. A schedule problem can be recovered from. A failure at altitude can't. Chen looked up. How do you hold that when the pressure is real? When the contract window is closing and the financial stakes are genuinely serious? You write it down, Adrian said. You log the flag, you log the time, you log who you told and what they said. Then whatever decision gets made, it's on the record. The pressure doesn't disappear. I'm not telling you the pressure isn't real. I'm telling you the record is what survives the pressure. It's what's there afterward, when everything has settled and someone needs to understand what happened and why. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I should have pushed harder that night. It wasn't a question and it wasn't directed at anyone specifically. It was the kind of thing a person says when they've been sitting with something long enough that it needs to come out in words. Probably, Adrian said, and said it without cruelty, just as the honest answer to an honest statement. But you're here now. Something in Chen's face shifted. Not resolution, it wasn't that clean, but something that moved in that direction, the incremental movement of a person deciding to carry a thing differently than they have been. The session moved on. They went through the dual reviewer signature protocol, which produced a lively 20 minutes of debate about implementation logistics that Adrian found genuinely useful, because the people arguing about it were the people who would have to use it, and their objections were specific and practical, and two of them pointed to places where his original draft could be improved. He made notes and told them he'd revise the relevant sections before the protocol went live, which was the right response, and which he could see the room register as the right response. The director of the program taking the technician's feedback as legitimate input, rather than as implementation resistance to be managed. At the end of the session, as people were packing up and the room was shifting into the informal post-meeting conversation that often contained more useful information than the meeting itself, Victoria stayed in her chair while others filtered out. When the room was down to her and Adrian and Park, who was finishing a note and appeared in no hurry, Victoria said, "That was worth being here for." "Good," Adrian said. "The part about the record surviving the pressure." She looked at the window, which showed the hangar apron in the flat January light. "I've been thinking about that since you said it. I make decisions under pressure every week. I'm not sure I've ever thought of them that way, as things the record will outlast." "Most people don't," Adrian said, "until the record becomes relevant." "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation." He picked up his legal pad. "The record always outlasts the pressure. That's true whether what's in the record is good or bad." Park, without looking up from her notes, said, "That's going on the wall in the inspection office." "Please don't put it on the wall," Adrian said. "Already decided," Park said, and capped her pen and left, which was the most Park thing possible to do. Victoria watched her go with an expression that was as close to openly amused as Adrian had seen from her, which was something. Then she looked back at him. "January 5th, she said. "The protocol went live 2 months in. How's it running?" 3 flags logged under the new system. 2 were sensor drift. 1 was a legitimate spec discrepancy on the second Sentinel platform that got caught 6 weeks ahead of certification. He paused. "The process is working." "And the people?" He thought about that. "They're logging more than they were. Whether that's because they trust the process or because they're watching to see if the process works, I can't tell yet. Give it another quarter." She nodded. "Fair." She stood, picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "Same time next month?" "I was going to suggest it," he said. She left, and Adrian stood in the empty conference room for a moment with his legal pad and his notes in the flat winter light, in the room that smelled like coffee and dry erase markers, and the particular institutional neutrality of a space used for many purposes and belonging to none of them specifically. He thought about Chen's question. How do you hold that when the pressure is real? It was the right question. The one that the protocol couldn't fully answer because it was a human question more than a procedural one. The protocol could require the documentation. It couldn't require the belief that the documentation mattered, the faith that the record was worth making even when nobody was watching, even when the pressure was real and the window was closing, and the easiest path was to accept the explanation already on offer and move on. That belief was something you either had or you developed through experience, and the experience was usually uncomfortable, and the discomfort was usually the point. You learned to trust the record because at some moment the record was the only thing that held, and after that moment you never quite forgot what it had held against. He picked up his materials and turned off the projector and walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and back into the hangar, where the second Sentinel aircraft sat in its construction cradle, incomplete and enormous, and full of the future problems and the future solutions that he hadn't found yet. He put on his work jacket and went to find them,